bourgeoisie out of here.
Hello, how are you doing today? Glad to hear that. The following is an essay called Syndicalism and Anarchism by Édouard Berth, which I have changed to Syndicalism versus Anarchism, so this video doesn't get mistaken for some anarcho-syndicalism bread tube content, and not the super Chad based video this actually is. Now this is to serve as a prelude for my big upcoming project explaining Sorel and his thought. Édouard Berth was Sorel's most loyal disciple. His following has even been described as mystical, spiritual, as though he viewed Sorel as some sort of mage or something. In fact, and we know this from Sorel's letters, the infamous stunt with Action Française and Cercle Proudhon was Sorel trying to secure a comfortable place for Berth because Sorel had become disillusioned with all socialist politics and was prepared to retire. Which he did until World War I came along. So after that, Berth went to the USSR. He said it was a society of termites, and then he came home and joined the French Communist Party, wrote for a student communist publication, and stayed at Sorel's deathbed in 1922, and then continued with communism and revolutionary syndicalism until his death in 1939. Berth was also German-speaking and translated works by Marx and Kautsky. The following essay asserts the Sorelian Marxist concept of proletarian self-organization and presents a ruthless criticism of everything from Max Stirner to the chatterbox of democracy. Suffice to say, this isn't the Marxism you're going to hear in your social justice or political science class. Socialism, i.e. revolutionary syndicalism, is a philosophy of the producers. It conceives society in accordance with the model of a progressive workshop without employers. In its view, everything that does not play a role in this workshop must disappear. Therefore, the first thing that must disappear is the state, which is the most outstanding representative of non-productive parasitic society. One could say that for socialism, what is most important is the categorical imperative of production, a form of production that is constantly being improved, such as the goal it pursues and the fundamental postulate of its philosophy of life. In this respect, it exhibits the same spirit as capitalism, and this is a result of the fact that syndicalism is the legitimate offspring of capitalism. From capitalism, it will inherit this progressive workshop and that love of an increasingly more advanced and comprehensive capacity for production. Everyone knows the apology for capitalism set forth by Marx in the Communist Manifesto, and it has often been observed that the Manchester School and the Marxists are in basic agreement regarding the essential trend of economic development. For one could say that these two schools have professed the same horror for protectionism, statism, and anything that could present an obstacle for that high level of productivity which is their shared ideal. Thus, while Marxism is a theory that is most appropriate for a truly revolutionary workers' movement, that is, it is the theory which represents the most economical, most advanced, and most accelerated pace of development of modern production. The Manchester School is, for its part, the theory that conforms most closely to the most highly developed forms of capitalism. But if syndicalism considers itself to be the heir of capitalism, upon what premises are its hopes for a possible transition from the capitalist workshop to the socialist workshop based? And what features distinguish the capitalist workshop from the socialist workshop? The capitalist workshop may be defined and characterized briefly by the words forced cooperation, based on coercion, while the socialist workshop can be characterized by saying that it will be free cooperation. The transition from one to the other is the transition from a regime of coercion to a regime of freedom. The famous leap from necessity to freedom that is mentioned in the Communist Manifesto. The question that arises is thus to understand how such a leap will be possible, and upon what premises the hopes for such a challenging and profound transformation are based. Syndicalism responds that this transformation is already prepared by capitalism itself, that within the very entrails of capitalism, there is a developmental process underway that is causing it to evolve from its commercial and usurious form into increasingly more industrial forms. That in the most modern industrial plant, it is in the process of replacing, at an ever-increasing pace, the discipline of mindless labor, which recalls more or less that which takes place in a workhouse and demands a totally passive form of obedience, with another more voluntary kind of labor, which is based on the sense of duty, a discipline that is therefore not external to the workers, but internal. And that this evolution may be summed up by saying that the requirements of technical skill are assuming more and more predominance over those of command and hierarchy, and that there is a growing degree of autonomy manifested by labor with regard to authority, production with regard to the state, and economics with regard to politics. Syndicalism is nothing but the transition to the culminating point of this evolution. This workshop without employers will not be created overnight, any more than it can just be taken as it is from the hands of the capitalists to the ineluctable process of capitalist economic development. We must add only a process based on conscious participation, by means of which the workers will prepare themselves to accept their inheritance. For according to Syndicalism, it is only by fighting hand to hand with capitalism that the working class can be trained, and only in this way can it emerge from its passivity and become active and acquire all the necessary qualities for its self-rule, without tutelage, over the great progressive workshop that capitalism has created and must bequeath to it. In any event, Syndicalism does not concern itself, as can be seen, with an abstract opposition between authority and freedom, or between the state and the individual. It is exclusively concerned with a real evolutionary process, one that is engendering an increasingly acute opposition between the demands of a constantly improved system of production and a coercive system of organization. An organizational form that rests upon the principles of hierarchical authority. And it is so evident that there is no question for Syndicalism of an abstract opposition between authority and freedom, that it expressly acknowledges that authority has been necessary until now, that it has been the spur thanks to which civilization has been able to advance and extract from human labor all the marvels that it has produced, and that, as Hegel said, obedience is the school of command. The recognition that Syndicalism grants to capitalism is not just limited to the material wealth the latter has created, but also, and even more importantly, to the moral and spiritual transformations it has impressed upon the working class masses, who, thanks to its iron discipline, have left their primitive laziness and their individualist anarchism behind them in order to take part in an increasingly more highly advanced form of collective labor. Syndicalism unequivocally acknowledges that civilization began, and had to begin, under conditions of coercion, and that this coercion was salutary, beneficial, and creative. and that if it is possible to hope for a regime of freedom without entrepreneurial or state guardianship, then this possibility only exists by virtue of that same coercive regime that has disciplined humanity, gradually rendering it capable of participating in free and voluntary labor. But is there anything more remote from these syndicalist points of view than the anarchist perspective? It could be said that, in opposition to this coercive regime, anarchism has stood for a permanent protest. It has endlessly denounced the civilization that requires such efforts in order to deliver so little happiness, and that this anarchist protest and denunciation originate in the revolt of the lazy individual, the primitive savage, the man in a state of nature who rebels against an iron-fisted regime that seeks to force him to submit to the discipline of work and to leave behind his primitive leisure, inactivity, and freedom. One may analyze the writings of all the anarchist authors. One will find the same hatred of civilization, understood as a coercive regime, as a system of discipline that compels men to work, to follow some other inclination than that of nature, creating what are, in their view, barbarous institutions because all of them demand an effort from man in order to tame his instincts, his passions, and his innate laziness. Read Rousseau, for instance. His vagrant humor, his love of independence, an entirely natural independence, his misanthropy, and the horror that society inspires in him, are all well known. Man, he proclaims, is naturally good. At the moment that he leaves the hands of his creator, it is civilization that causes him to be depraved. All of anarchist thought is already contained here. A naive optimism, an ingenious belief in man's good instincts. The idea that one can leave human nature alone and allow it to be abandoned to its instincts. That all social institutions have done nothing but corrupt it, and that, in order to return men to their state of primitive goodness, it is necessary to unburden them of that whole collection of demoralizing institutions that go by the name of family, property, and state. Marriage must be replaced by free unions, property by each person taking what he wants, the state by each person doing what is advantageous for him. It has often been observed that the anarchists come from artisanal, peasant, or aristocratic backgrounds. Rousseau clearly represents the artisanal anarchism. His republic is a small republic of free and independent artisans that can only be conceived on such an economic basis. In Proudhon, his individualist anarchism, we must point out that there is more to his ideas than just this aspect, which we shall presently see is indisputably of a peasant origin. Proudhon is a peasant at heart, and it is unfair to call him petit bourgeois. And if finally we consider Tolstoy, we discover in his works an anarchism of an elite or aristocratic stamp. Tolstoy is a weary aristocrat, displeased with civilization because he had his fill of its enjoyments, which led him to experience the stoical and peace-loving emotions of a primitive nature. To him, all of civilization seemed to be without any meaning, a monstrosity that only creates poverty and crime, which gives birth to war, violence, and cruel hatreds, when the only reality is love. Tolstoy's thought is verily the thought of a primitive, of a world-weary person who, in an entirely natural reaction, returns to the simplistic thought of primitive man. The jaded spectator of a spectacle that he has seen too many times. He seeks happiness and the meaning of life in every discipline, in science, in philosophy, in civilization as a whole. And it is a simple Musik who is the only one who responds in a way that he finds valid. To live is to love, to have simple pleasures, to lead a peaceful and God-fearing life. Here we can observe a case of mental regression, a kind of intellectual degeneration that reflects fatigue and exhaustion, natural in an aristocrat. The denizens of high society live in a fictitious world, distant from the real world, alien to all real creation and all productive activity. Gamblers who soon grow tired of their way of life, soon long for a kind of state of nature, the way a sick person looks forward to recover his health in the countryside. Regardless, however, of whether anarchism is derived from an artisanal, peasant, or aristocratic origin, it is always a protest against capitalist civilization, which is considered to be a barbarous and monstrous regime of violence and oppression. And the nature of this protest consists in its purely negative and even reactionary character. It is the protest of the classes on the fringe of capitalism, for whom capitalism has disrupted their way of life, done away with their customs, and constituted an insult to their deepest and most traditional feelings. The syndicalist protest is very different. Syndicalism, as we have pointed out, considers itself to be the direct heir of capitalism and admires the latter's creative abilities. Far from harboring towards it that feeling of revulsion that a savage experiences, I employ this term savage as a synonym for solitary, for an individual for whom, given his way of life, there is no social life. So that according to this definition, an artisan, a peasant, and even a worldly gentleman are savages. Because society is a coordination of efforts that are mutually reinforced by the efforts of various individuals, and not just a juxtaposition of egoisms in search of pleasure. Syndicalism considers capitalism to be a marvelous wizard who knew how, thanks to the audacity combined with individual initiative and cooperation, to conjure all the infinite human productive forces and make them emerge from the depths of social labor, where they had previously slumbered. But it also thinks that the historical role of capitalism, which has awakened the social genie from its sleep, which has rescued the worker from his isolation, and which has subjected men to collective labor, has now come to an end. The workers, now that they have been constituted as production groups, and after they have acquired, over the course of their long struggles against their employers, the spirit of audacity and initiative, along with the taste for free association, can carry on with the mission of capitalism without any more need of its tutelage or its compulsion. There is a transfusion of the spirit of initiative and responsibility from the contemporary private manager of an enterprise to the body of the productive group. And at the same time, the power of the workers' collective, now its own master, is no longer recruited or alienated for the benefit of just one person. But it is precisely this social character of freedom that is denied by anarchism. And one can justly say that, in a certain sense, anarchism is nothing but an exaggerated form of bourgeois ideology. Nor are we referring here to anarchism in its early anti-capitalist form, if one can call it that, but to its ultra-capitalist form. This is expressed above all in Stirner's book, The Ego and Its Own. We have said that bourgeois society is divided into two pools. On the one side, individuals, free competitors on a free market. On the other side, the state, administrative centralization, let us assume that this historical passage has reached the extreme to which we have referred. Let us assume that civil society has rid itself of the state and that all that remains is the individual, the ego, and its own. In The Jewish Question, Marx, discussing the rights of man, says that these rights are the rights of the egoist man, because man is considered as an isolated monad, because each man sees in his neighbor not the realization, but the limitation of his personal freedom, and because these rights do not extend beyond the individual man, barricaded behind his particular interests and his personal whims, separated from the life and activity of the community. Compared to this egoist man, the member of civil society, the political man is nothing but an artificial man, an abstract man, an allegorical personage. And Marx goes on to quote the following important words of Rousseau: "He who dares to undertake the making of a people's institutions ought to feel himself capable, so to speak, of changing human nature, of transforming each individual, who is by himself a complete and solitary whole, into part of a greater whole, from which he, in a manner, receives his life and being, of altering man's constitution for the purpose of strengthening it, and of substituting a partial and moral existence for the physical and independent existence nature has conferred on us all. He must, in a word, take away from man his own resources and give him instead new ones alien to him, and capable of being made use of without the help of other men." Stirner's anarchist is simply the egoist man of civil society, who rejects all the abstract and artificial superstructure of political society, and who does not want to have anything to do with that abstract man, that allegorical personage, as Marx called him, known as the citizen. And it should be pointed out that, in the practical sense, anarchism is reduced to not using the right to vote, or not carrying out the duties of the citizen, and rejecting any participation in the abstract life of democratic society. It is well known that the whole metaphysical system of Stirner is based on the negation of the ideas, which are, according to him, chimeras, spooks, which confiscate individual freedom and whose despotic and fabulous rule must be overthrown. Stirner claimed to represent the opposition to Hegel. His book is particularly intended to be an attack on the absolute idealism that is for him synonymous with absolute despotism. And he is undoubtedly at least partly correct. Did Hegel not make the state the actualization of the idea? Marxism, however, as everyone knows, reacted no less violently than Stirner against such a divinization of the state. But whereas Stirner, from an extreme simplicity, was content, in order to free the individual, with a pure and simple rejection of the abstract superstructure of political society so as to preserve nothing but the egoist individual of civil society. Marx, who was just as aware as Stirner was of the abstract character of political life, employs a much more concrete and positive procedure to simultaneously overcome both the particularist character of bourgeois civil society and the abstract character of the political society, which are resolved into the producer society. Political emancipation, as Marx wrote in The Jewish Question, is the reduction of man into a member of bourgeois society or the egoistic and independent individual, on the one hand and on the other, to a political citizen, a moral and allegorical personage. Therefore, true human emancipation will only be achieved when the real individual man, by reabsorbing the abstract citizen, will be transformed into a social being. In his everyday life, in his work, in his individual affairs, when man consciously and thoroughly organizing his own powers as social powers, will no longer be separated from social power in the form of political power. This is the Marxist solution. We need not belabor the fact that it is also the syndicalist solution. The latter rejects the political abstraction, which was considered by Marx as well as by Stirner as oppressive. But while Stirner rejected this oppression only to retreat into the palpable particularity of civil society, and only becomes free of the yoke of abstract thought by falling prey to pure and simple empiricism, Marx was able to simultaneously supersede both concrete particularity and abstract universality, in order to discover the concrete universal. And this concrete universal is precisely the life of the syndicates, in which social forces, without allowing themselves to be either absorbed or transformed by political forces, organize autonomously and freely, where man becomes a social being in his everyday existence, in his individual efforts, in the abstract citizen of the political city is reabsorbed, and the egoist man of civil society is transformed into the multifaceted and concrete personality of the social syndicate worker. In the working class collectivity, which master of the workshop, scientifically and politically qualified, eliminates by way of absorption every kind of parasite, the state such as it exists in Hegel's thinking state. This amounts to the end of those ideologies whose chimeras Stirner sought to dispel, as well as that civil anarchy into which his individualism is completely submerged. But anarchist metaphysics is incapable of understanding this Marxist and syndicalist revolution because, in its view, society does not have an independent existence and is only manifested as a restriction, an abstract repression of individual independence. The metaphysics for which society is nothing but a juxtaposition of individual units in a monadological or atomistic metaphysics. For such a metaphysics, only the individual is real. Everything else is only a fantasy, a chimera, or an illusion. Anarchism transforms the individual into an absolute, incapable of joining any social combination without having a sense of being arbitrarily repressed and stifled. And if we call the economic origins of anarchism artisanal, agricultural, or aristocratic, this is just how anarchism had to conceive of the individual and his relations with society. Socialism has a completely different conception, and in its view, society does not mean the arbitrary juxtaposition or sum of individuals who are absolute and do not join a system of that kind without simultaneously experiencing a mutual restriction and diminution. But rather the contrary. It views society as a system of cooperation in which the cumulative efforts of all its members multiply in such a way that for the individual there is not loss, but a net gain from his participation in these efforts, because solitude is equivalent to impotence, poverty, and disability, while association means power, wealth, and capabilities that are multiplied 1,000-fold. In a word, for socialism, society is a true reality and the individual is nothing, so to speak, but an abstraction that is a part of social existence, possesses a reality of which the individual is only one aspect, one phenomenon, which is just what anarchism denies, and instead posits the individual as the only reality. No one has expounded this theory of the reality of the social being as magnificently as Proudhon, the so-called father of anarchism. Proudhon, of course, according to Marx and Engels, was nothing but a preposterous petit bourgeois who hated association from the bottom of his heart. Nonetheless, this petit bourgeois, this man who hated association, this anarchist, has admirably described the reality of social existence. If you have any doubt of this, just read his Justice in the Revolution and the Church, or his philosophy of progress. In these works, you will find a theory of collective power and a presentation of a metaphysical doctrine of existence, essentially conceived in the form of the group. More generally, it would not be futile to cap off this study of anarchism and syndicalism. To take a look at Proudhonian anarchism, we shall see that this alleged anarchism is actually what we call syndicalism. Not exactly, of course, but with regard to its spirit and its most typical tendency. Yes, it is true. Proudhon is, along with Marx, the most authentic theoretical precursor of revolutionary syndicalism, and after demonstrating why his thought has almost nothing in common with traditional anarchism and instead approximates syndicalism, we shall then proceed in an eminently useful manner. In our opinion, to show how anarchism differs from syndicalism, we shall start by examining this essential theory of the reality of social existence. Then we shall see how Proudhon's ideas about Then we shall see how Proudhon's ideas about those social institutions that go by the names of the family, the state, and property, or concerning those social realities known as love, war, and production, are 1,000 miles from anarchist ideas. We shall therefore introduce a few decisive quotations into the debate. In his admirable first letter on progress, here he cites several paragraphs of Proudhon, so I'll put them in the description for you. You can read them yourself. I'm fucking not gonna read this shit. But yeah, there's how many of these? Yeah, there's fucking at least 4. Yeah, no, you can read that yourself. Please forgive the length of these quotations. Yeah, fuck off. But they are needed to set the record straight concerning so many prejudices about Proudhon, which so often take the form of a cavalier dismissal of him as an anarchist or petit bourgeois. I mean, you should read them. I'm just not going to read them for you. And I dare to ask anyone who carefully reads this magnificent depiction of the reality of social existence, whether it is possible to define Proudhon as an anarchist. Here we touch upon the heart of the matter. Here we see the profound difference between the socialist philosophy and the anarchist metaphysics displayed in all its splendor. The basis of all anarchism is, as we have seen, the individual, the ego, considered as a simple being, as an absolute, as a kind of monad which, following Leibniz, has neither doors nor windows connecting it to the outside, and which, as a result, is incommensurable and unsociable by its very nature. Upon such a basis, there is no need to say that it is utterly impossible to undertake any reconstruction of society and the idea of the social, because its starting point is the radical denial of such a possibility, and it would be just as absurd to seek to rebuild society using unsociable and isolated units as it would be chimerical to expect to set unmovable objects in motion. It is first necessary to consider the movement and to insert oneself in it. Then one may conceive of stasis as a kind of arrested development. Likewise, one must take society into consideration, insert oneself into it, and then conceive of the individual as a kind of paralysis. The individual in society, like stasis within movement, are nothing but provisional and temporarily useful abstractions. To construct these abstractions as reality, to transform them into the only realities, it is to radically turn your back on life and truth. It is to collapse and lose oneself in the simplistic idea of a false, abstract rationalism. This is, however, the essential error of anarchist metaphysics, an error in which socialism is not implicated, and to which Proudhon did not succumb, who, as we just saw, begins by establishing, above all, the reality of social existence. Socialism gives its primary consideration to society. Its starting point is not the individual who is set in abstract opposition to society, but the workshop, the social laborer. Plekhanov, at the end of his study, Anarchism and Socialism, asserts that in the final accounting, the anarchists are nothing but decadent bourgeois. But what does decadent mean in this context? What feature indicates that a society is in decline? It is not precisely the fact that the social idea loses all of its meanings, and the individual is raised to the highest level and is abstractly proclaimed as the final and absolute end, sounds familiar, and by means of his formidable egocentrism, everything is reduced to the individual. The individual isolated in his private enjoyment, this is the cardinal feature of all decadence. And this enjoyment can take the most varied forms, the most spiritual as well as the most material. Egocentrism can call itself art for art's sake or assume another disguise, more subtle and moralistic, humanitarianism. It can be Epicurean or Stoic, Christian or pagan. It can invoke conscience, science, freedom, or beauty. But it is always, in the final analysis, the denial of the social idea. The refusal on the part of the individual to devote himself to any collective effort of any kind. It hardly matters that this refusal is concealed under moral, idealist, or even humanitarian reasons. For egoism, the love of humanity and the religion of suffering are very comfortable garments, and more pleasing than any others. And one of the most profound theses of Proudhon's moral philosophy is that idealism leads to corruption and that the ideal itself the origin of evil. What is an ideal? Any ideal whatsoever. It is an aspect of reality, separated from reality and raised to the status of an absolute. It is what Proudhon calls a speculative simplicity. Substance, cause, monad, atom, mind, or matter, which replaces the essentially synthetic idea of existence. Reality is mobile. It is movement or progress, but the idealist attempts to replace this fluid reality with something immutable, his ideal, and to freeze the whole flow of things into the boundaries of this ideal. It withdraws from movement, it establishes an alleged superior vantage point, and from there it seeks to govern, that is, stabilize and arrest life. Idealism is doomed to end up, then, in immobilism, in stasis, that is, in corruption and decadence. For if, as Proudhon also puts it, most admirably, movement is the natural state of matter, then justice is the natural state of humanity. Therefore, justice is nothing but movement in society. It is humanity in a dynamic and progressive state. Humanity fighting or producing, whose powers tend towards a continuous adaptation to an always changing reality. Corruption or decadence is, on the other hand, the attempt to immobilize oneself in enjoyment outside the social movement, which is the indefatigable creator of new social forms. Anarchism is a form of idealism, or intellectualism. It consists in the transformation of the idea of freedom into an absolute, and we have already seen how it was the ideal of individuals who belong to classes that seek to resist the movement of capitalism and to freeze conditions so they can preserve the economic status quo. Or else of individuals who want to destroy bourgeois society and reduce it to one single element, the particularistic egoism of civil society. Anarchism, therefore, constitutes a response on the part of the resistance against progress, or it is the dissolution of this progress. Syndicalism, on the other hand, not only has nothing to do with resistance to capitalist progress, but currently is acting to spur it on and drive it forward, and thus preventing it from stopping its forward movement and freezing in place, and looks forward to a future where its own productive potential will grow even more than capitalism's. Syndicalism, therefore, represents, from a dual motivation, the movement and the progress of today's society. It is a new and vigorous power which, embodying the new social ideal, fights to prevent social decline and to save civilization. The fact that the anarchists only represent bourgeois social decadence emerges with complete clarity if, disregarding for the moment the metaphysical theses concerning the reality or the non-reality of social existence, we examine their way of addressing the question of the family, that primary manifestation and unmediated form of social life. Here, too, we notice the same fundamental incompatibility between Proudhon and anarchism. For everyone knows that anarchism conceives of the sexual partnership as a free, temporary, and ephemeral union, and that, as a result, love is reduced to a volatile passion and a marriage to a revocable ad libitum contract. A civil contract of the same nature as other contracts, lacking any sacred or religious character, and everyone also knows that, on the other hand, for Proudhon, the sexual union is an irrevocable and dissoluble union. That for him, love is subordinated to justice by marriage, because the very symbol of justice is the androgynous couple. As you see, you cannot imagine a more fundamental opposition on such an essential question of such primary significance, a question whose answer will depend entirely on the respondent's orientation with regard to social morality. Anarchism, then, puts its denial of the social idea into practice. The idea of freedom, raised to the status of an absolute by anarchism, dissolves the family. Nothing remains but the individual with his ephemeral passions and his disordered romanticism. And who would dare deny that this is a frantic and decadent bourgeoisism? It will be objected that Proudhon's ideas about marriage are ultra-reactionary ideas, and that both the socialists and the anarchists have adopted, with regard to this issue, the extravagant ideas of Fourier. In any event, this is not to the credit of socialism, which in regard to this, as to so many other questions, has deplorably followed in the footsteps of the bourgeois tradition, rather than the working class tradition, which has sought to inoculate, as Édouard said, the emerging proletariat with the corruption of the moribund bourgeoisie. But now let us examine the ideas of Proudhon and the anarchists, respectively on a no less crucial issue, war. Everyone is familiar with the anarchist abhorrence for war and militarism, as well as the magnificent praise Proudhon bestows upon war in his book, War and Peace. Never before was such a brilliant and exalted panegyric pronounced. You would have to go all the way back to the Greek philosopher Heraclitus to find its equal. We shall not discuss Hegel because Proudhonian thought displays in this context such obvious evidence of its Hegelian origin that we may dispense with any further mention of this. Is it not significant, by the way, that the two great socialist philosophers, the two great theoreticians of the class struggle, Marx and Proudhon, are Hegelians, in the broadest sense of the word? But what is the main idea of war and peace? That since conflict is the fundamental law of the universe, peace, if it is ever possible, must be conceived otherwise than as a negation of war. That peace will be nothing but a transformation of war, a new form of that eternal conflict which is the law of the world, both the social world as well as the natural world. That the tranquil and pacifist peace, the universal embrace that all our decadent bourgeoisie, our parliamentary socialists, and our humanitarian anarchists dream of, is impossible, or even if it were possible, it would be for mankind. It would for mankind be synonymous with stagnation, with immobility, with a complete relaxation of the nervous system, and death. War will disappear someday. Proudhon announces and proclaims the end of the cycle of wars. But this conclusion will only give way to a warlike peace that will demand of men virtues that are no less great or heroic than those demanded by war itself. For industry is also a battlefield, where the combatants must demonstrate no less bravery, no less scorn for pleasure, and no less indifference to death than in the campaigns of real war. In industry, too, victory will go to the bravest, the most energetic, the most bold, and the cowardly, the pusillanimous, and the egotistical will be defeated. But industry is superior to war because, while the latter is a pure destruction of forces, the former repairs any harm that it may cause. Listen to Proudhon. The objective of war is to determine which of two parties to a dispute has the supremacy of force. It is a struggle between forces, not their destruction. A struggle between men, not their extermination. It must abstain, outside of combat and the succeeding political annexation, from any attacks on persons or property. Whether it can be deduced that we accept the law of humanity and of nature as laws of conflict, this conflict does not essentially consist of a fistfight or a hand-to-hand struggle between men. It could also be a struggle for industry and progress, which, in the final analysis, given the spirit of war and the elevated civilized goals that it pursues, amount to the same thing. The empire goes to the bravest. That is what war says. But labor, industry, and economics respond, maybe. But whence is the bravery of a man, or a nation, derived? It is not from his resourcefulness, his virtue, his character, his science, his industry, his labor, his wealth, his sobriety, his freedom, and his love for his country. Didn't the Grand Capitaine say that in war, moral force is to physical force as 3 is to 1? Don't they teach us, furthermore, about the laws of war and of the honor of gentlemen, that in combat we must maintain our dignity and abstain from any wanton harm, treason, looting, and pillage? So we shall fight. We shall attack each other with the bayonet, and will shoot at each other. In these new battles we shall have to provide the same proofs of resolve, of sacrifice, of scorn for life and pleasure. The dead and wounded will be no less numerous, and all that is cowardly, weak, coarse, everything that is lacking strength and spirit, must expect contempt, misery. Thus the transformation of conflict results from its very definition, from its movement, from its law, hence also from its purpose. For conflict does not have the object of pure and simple destruction. An unproductive consumption, extermination for the sake of extermination, its object is the production of an always higher order, of an endless improvement. In this respect, it must be acknowledged that labor offers conflict a vast and fertile field of operations that is different from the theater of war. We must note, above all, that this industrial field, the opposed forces wage a struggle that is no less passionate than the one waged on the battlefield. Here, too, there is a mutual destruction and assimilation, in labor as in war. The raw material of combat, its primary expenditure, is human blood. In a sense that is by no means metaphorical. We live on our own substance and that of our brothers. But with the enormous difference that, in the industrial struggle, defeat is really inflicted only on those who have not fought at all, or who have only done so in a cowardly fashion. So that as a result, labor returns to its armies all that it consumes, something that war does not do, which is capable of creating nothing. In labor, production follows destruction. The forces consumed re-arise from their dissolution more energetic than ever. The purpose of the conflict, the advantage sought from it, demands that this takes place. If anything else were to take place, the world would sink into chaos, a negation of the fact that, thanks to war, the world is not the way it was at the dawn of creation, nothing but atoms in the void. Terra autem erat in nihis evacua. Now the world was formless and empty. Genesis 1:2. As you can see, Proudhon's essential idea is that labor is the replacement for war. The worker replaces the soldier, industrial struggles succeed military campaigns, Already in his general idea of the revolution, Proudhon had written, "In place of public force, we will put collective force. In place of standing armies, we will put industrial associations." Concerning these industrial associations, he previously said, "Finally appear the working men's associations, regular armies of the revolution, in which the worker, like the soldier in the battalion, maneuvers with the precision of his machines, in which thousands of wills, intelligent and proud, submit themselves to a superior will, as the hands controlled by them engender, by their concerted action, a collective force greater than even their number." This constantly recurring parallel drawn between labor and war, between the working class virtues and military virtues, between the industrial associations, today we would call them syndicates, and the standing armies, is it not curious and suggestive? Revolutionary syndicalism has taken a clear stand against the army, military, and patriotism. But if we examine the basis of working class anti-militarism, we find something else behind it. Ideas and feelings that are different from those of bourgeois anti-militarism. For there is, as everyone knows, a bourgeois anti-militarism, a bourgeois pacifism, and a bourgeois anti-patriotism. That is, a bourgeois cosmopolitanism, the businessmen and the intellectuals. The two essential categories into which the bourgeoisie is divided have always been distinguished by their pious horror of war. Within each bourgeois lives a panurge, and a panurge does not like to receive blows. A war is furthermore quite expensive, and for the businessman, for whom everything is reduced to a question of debit and credit, the resort to the ruinous solution of war seems absurd when there is an opportunity for a diplomatic solution or arbitration, which are so much less burdensome. The bourgeois does not understand honor, a feeling that does not circulate on the market, a value which is not quoted on the stock exchange. As for the intellectual, it seems just as absurd to him to fight when it is easy to reason. And in the market of ideas, where he is a broker, the feeling of honor circulates no more than in the market of financial values. The intellectual is at the bottom nothing but a businessman, and we cannot ask him to understand the concept of warlike heroism. But the feelings inspired by war in the businessman and the intellectual are also inspired by the strike. Whenever a strike breaks out, you can read in the bourgeois newspapers reliable statistics which depict the losses suffered by the workers. The strike, like war, appears to our bourgeois to be the very height of stupidity, and our socialists do not know what to do to prevent the workers from indulging in this progressive deterioration, as Wars calls it. It would be preferable to accept fair arbitration, even arbitration that is systematic and compulsory. So that reason, law, order, and civilization will replace barbarism, anarchy, and chaos. Our parliamentary socialists, like good bourgeois, are fervent social pacifists, as well as fervent internationalist pacifists. The bourgeois does not know what a national or working class collectivity is, nor can he, without any doubt, understand that the honor of this collectivity is something that is superior to a calculus of profit and loss. The bourgeois is a true individualist, anarchist. For him, nothing exists except his ego. He is rootless, a cosmopolitan, for whom there are no countries or classes. Do not ask him to sacrifice his precious person for anything. He has no social idea, and the words self-abnegation and sacrifice have lost all meaning for him. Working class anti-militarism is something completely different. This anti-militarism does not originate in an abstract or sentimental horror of war and the army. It originates in the class struggle. It was born in the experience of strikes and trade union struggles where the worker always faces the army, the guardian of capital and of order. For which reason he has always viewed it as a simple extension of the capitalist workshop, and as a result, as the living symbol of his servitude. Precisely for this reason, however, his anti-militarism is no longer an individual protest against the barracks in the name of more or less abstract principles, nor is it the simple sense of nature and humanity. War sounds the most powerful note. Its works sweep over the soul like thunder, like the voice of the hurricane, a mixture of genius and boldness, of poetry and passion, of the highest justice and tragic heroism. Its majesty dazzles us, and the more we contemplate it, the more our hearts are filled with enthusiasm. War, perceived by a false philosophy and an even falser philanthropy, as nothing but a horrible scourge, an outburst of our innate evil and a manifestation of heavenly anger, is the most incorruptible expression of our conscience, the act that confers the most honor on us in the light of creation and eternity. The idea of war is equivalent to its phenomenology. It is one of those ideas that, from the very first moment of their appearance, absorb all one's attention, that make us confess, so to speak, with full knowledge and with full feeling, and to which, by virtue of their universality, logic gives the name of categories. For war is both unitary and triune like God. It is the unitary in one nature of these three roots: force, the principle of movement and of life, which is found in the ideas of cause, soul, will, freedom, and spirit; conflict, action, reaction, the universal law of the world; and, like force, one of Kant's 12 categories; and justice, the sovereign faculty of the soul, the principle of our practical reason, which is manifested in nature by equilibrium. If we pass from the phenomenology and the idea of war to its object, it forfeits none of our admiration. The purpose of war, its role in humanity, consists in encouraging all the human faculties and thus creating in the center of and above these faculties law, and making it universal, and with the help of this universalization of law in defining and forming society. Here, when speaking of war, Proudhon uses the language of poetry or mysticism, as if he were dealing with a supernatural phenomenon that gives birth to supernatural events. This stands in total opposition to anarchist philosophy, which in the final analysis advocates that we return to the state of nature and rejects anything that obliges man to emerge from this state. Imagined as one of perfect bliss, man is a being that must be surpassed. The philosopher of the will to power, he's talking about Nietzsche, says, who is mistakenly identified by some people as an anarchist, and man only overcomes his condition, he only becomes a hero, by participating in the great struggles in which the heroic or divine accomplishments of history are embodied. And it is in this aspect that the greatness of war resides, in that it elevates everything to sublime heights and causes man, as Proudhon also said, to rise above himself. War created law, it created the state, it created the citizen, has defined and molded society, that supernatural being. And the revolution does not owe its historic prestige to the proceedings of assemblies, or even to international congresses. It lived in the heart of the people as a military epic for many years, and the wars of the Republic and the Empire provided the raw material for popular poetry throughout the 18th century. Pretty sure it's supposed to be the 19th century. I don't know if it's a mistake on the translator or of Berth, but yeah. Today it is notorious that revolutionary patriotism is dead. Something else has arisen to take its place. A new feeling, the class idea, which has replaced the idea of the fatherland, defining the split between the people on the one side and the state and democracy on the other. For with the appearance of revolutionary syndicalism, a strange opposition has arisen between democracy and socialism, between the citizen and the producer, an opposition that has assumed its crudest as well as its most abstract form in the resolute rejection of the idea of the fatherland, which is identified with the idea of the state. And the strikes, which are becoming increasingly more powerful, more widespread, and more frequent, are revealing to a surprised world the collective power of the workers, who are becoming more class conscious and more self-controlled with each passing day. These strikes are assuming the form of the social phenomenon par excellence. Through their abruptness, their audacity, and the marvelous discipline they impose on the army of the workers, they are acquiring increasingly more martial features and compromise on the social terrain, a veritable war on another level. And the words that Proudhon pronounced concerning war can also be applied to the strikes. These strikes are what today sound, in the songs of nature and of humanity, the most powerful note. They affect the soul like the sound of thunder and the voice of the hurricane. They combine genius with boldness, poetry, and passion, the highest justice and tragic heroism. Their majesty dazzles us. What kind of birth process are we witnessing? In the face of these volcanic tremors that the world of labor is periodically causing modern society to undergo, we see all the disoriented parties. We see all the decomposing ideologies, all the prudent timidity. What is happening? Something that is once both simple and formidable. Labor is proceeding to occupy the first rank, driving out all parasites, from the most obvious and crude to the most subtle and refined. The workshop is coming into its own, making everything that is not a function of labor disappear. All of social life is being rebuilt on the plane of production, becoming, as was previously the case with regard to war's impact on the ancient city, the cement of the modern city. In short, what is happening is that labor is creating a new civilization, in which life, once labor, has reabsorbed all the transcendent intellectual powers into the world of production, and thus put an end to the sterile divorce between theory and practice, in which life, I say, will recover its health, unity, and balance. What neither gymnastics, nor politics, nor music, nor philosophy, bringing together their efforts, knew how to do. Proudhon writes, labor will accomplish. As in the ancient ages the initiation to beauty came by way of the gods, so, in a remote posterity, beauty will be revealed anew by the laborer, the true ascetic, and it is from the innumerable forms of industry that it will demand its changing expression, always new and always true. Then, finally, the logos will be manifested, and the human laborers, more beautiful and more free than ever were the Greeks, without nobles and without slaves, without magistrates and without priests, will form all together on the cultivated earth one family of heroes, thinkers, and artists. At the sites of strikes, our new battlefields, the workers are conquering their titles of nobility and are founding a new order. Just as it was on the battlefields of Valmy, Jemappes, and Fleurus, that the citizen soldiers of year 2 of the First Republic won democracy and the right to exist. But pay close attention. I will once again refer to these very important words of Proudhon. What neither gymnastics, nor politics, nor music, nor philosophy, bringing together their efforts, knew how to do, labor will accomplish. A few lines before this passage, Proudhon discussing Plato said, "Divine Plato, these gods that you dreamed do not exist. There is nothing in the world greater and more beautiful than man. But man, rising from the hands of nature, is miserable and ugly. He can only become sublime and beautiful through gymnastics, politics, philosophy, music, and especially something which you hardly appear to doubt, the ascetic." And Proudhon explains, in a footnote, what he means by the ascetic is industrial labor or work, which were viewed as servile and ignoble among the ancients. Here we have, marvelously highlighted, the opposition between education, understood in the classical manner, the way it has always been understood by ancient or modern democracy, and education as understood in the socialist manner. We shall repeat. Socialism is a philosophy of the producers. It reduces society to the level of the workshop and recognizes no right to existence that is not a direct or indirect function of the workshop. Naturally, education in its view must not be oriented to the training of a chatterbox citizen, a dilettante who knows a little about a lot of things, as the operation of political democracy requires, but of a producer who knows his trade inside and out and is capable of participating in the collective labor of a progressive modern workshop, such as would be required by the organization of a system of production that is free of all tutelage and parasitism. It is well known that Proudhon, once again in agreement with Marx and in opposition to anarchism, always conceived of education as intimately bound to the workshop, to productive labor, as he maintains in his The General Idea of the Revolution and the Political Capacity of the Working Classes. Against this idea, anarchism advocates, as is well known, the anarchist ideal of integral education, that is, an encyclopedic and therefore superficial, mundane, and bourgeois general education. In this respect as well, anarchism is undoubtedly nothing but a simple echo of the 18th century, the great bourgeois century, as Sorel has justly called it. Was it not natural, on the other hand, that anarchism, nourished on abstractions, just as foreign to economic preoccupations as democracy itself, and granting reality solely to the individual, the abstract, solitary, monadic individual who is self-sufficient, was it not natural that anarchism would end up by conceiving of education as a kind of universal mechanical transfer of the totality of human knowledge into the mind of this atom individual? This is yet another manifestation of the metaphysical simple-mindedness of our anarchists. They do not transcend the bourgeois horizon any more than our democrats, which is logical, because if our deputies, our masters, have to know everything, since they have to deal with everything in our stead, the anarchist individual must be possessed of an equally comprehensive knowledge, since he must by himself constitute all of society. With respect to both these approaches, there is a denial of society conceived as free cooperation in which productive activities mutually condition and multiply each other. As one can see, whether we consider the problem of war or that of production, Proudhon and anarchism are totally incompatible, and because we consider Proudhon to be the most authentic theoretician of the past, alongside Marx, whom Syndicalism can invoke as a precursor. I think I have the right to conclude that there are profound differences between anarchism and Syndicalism. It is quite obvious, furthermore, that the Syndicalists must confront not only the open opposition of socialism, where the remnants of the old Gusedism are still trying to stammer a few words, but also the opposition of le temps nouveau, where the remnants of the old anarchism are attempting to resist their increasing absorption into revolutionary syndicalism. But even more importantly, the theoretical pretensions of individuals have only a minimal historical value. Men rarely have an exact account of what is taking place before their eyes. Revolutionary syndicalism has arisen, it has grown, it is a social movement whose profundity escapes the narrow perspectives of theoreticians who vainly cling to their old ideas. This is enough, Syndicalism can say, adopting the motto Marx cited, Segui il tuo corso e lascia delle genti. Follow your own road and let the people talk. So, what in this essay can we say are the Sorelian ideas? Well, firstly, the view of revolution as neither an abstract and narrowly defined eternal protest against civilization, nor as a matter of a violent takeover of the state to push a party agenda, and certainly not an evolutionary transformation using policies that are believed to be ideologically aligned with socialism. The self-movement of the concept does not exist. Rather, a revolution is a cataclysmic event, where we imagine the solid block of a society organized into a system that is governed by inescapable iron laws, is shattered into pieces, and a progressive buildup and restructuring by the productive class begins through the development of new bottom-up institutions and social customs, which reorganize social relations and unfetter production, allowing for the transformation of society into a new solid block governed by different iron laws. That is revolution. All other conceptions of revolution and social change that do not speak in these terms are just different categories of optimism. From the most angry and bloodthirsty to the most timid and passive. Revolutionary pessimism is where we declare that the notion of the march into deliverance, spoken of by idealists and effeminate men, is narrowly defined. Expect to hear more about this when I release my presentation of Sorel. The second Sorelian idea to be found here is this view of society as a sort of constant social war, and only in a state of peace when it is in stagnation. The social war is not to be confused with abstract bloodlust and militarism, but this conception rejects the idea of an organic unity held by all sorts of optimists. Again, expect to hear more in the presentation on Sorel. Personally, though, I think Berth's essay gives a mixed presentation on Sorelian thought. The first half is, I think it's genius, and probably among some of the best political writings in history. But the second half devolves into, pure autism. The first notable criticism is the sheer volume of Proudhon quotes, which makes it feel like reading a Pierre Trudenk video. And which it wouldn't be so much of a problem if the purpose of these citations wasn't for his long-winded rant where he tries to argue that Proudhon wasn't an anarchist. Which I think is a fool's errand. I mean, yes, I agree, Proudhon has a greater conception of the social idea, which rejects the organic unity of contemporary anarchists' universal timid barbarism. But for a thinker with such a strong conviction in natural law, and that the state exists in constant negation of it, to say he isn't an anarchist is ridiculous. One of the most advanced and social individualist anarchist thinkers for sure, but an anarchist nonetheless. It is also worthy to note that while Berth's diagnosis of anarchism is entirely Sorelian, and, correct, Sorel was actually quite friendly with anarchists, and Reflections of Violence, which was published around the same time as this essay, also contains only positive things about anarchists. Also, another criticism is that Berth presents this view of social emancipation as more collectivist than it actually is. What is more correct to say, which is also how Sorel puts it, is that this conception of a society of highly social and productive but free labor is really the most beneficial and fulfilling for the individual, instead of retreating to the natural order like a man sick from overindulging in the delicacies of modern society. And he was pretty much on that point, but he decided to go into, no, stupid anarchist, your freedom is stupid. What we need is the social idea of the productive industrial war, the heroic soldiers of industry, and the social progressive war, the social idea towards the autism, Lastly, while he is correct to assert Proudhon's idea of sexual and marriage affairs over the Fourieran idea, the Proudhonian idea is still premised on the optimistic and idealist view of natural law, which in Proudhonian terms viewed fidelity as not only being the height of morality, but containing all of morality. Sorel correctly pointed to the ridiculousness of this in Reflections sur les violences by pointing out that this is only the custom of a certain social order and that natural law doesn't actually exist. Finally, the weird flirtation with a sort of social proletarian nationalism by portraying the philanthropic bourgeoisie as entirely cosmopolitan with no sense of nation is, I think, a source of a lot of misconceptions about Sorel. And also an ironic remark, which certainly proved to be so in 8 years when the First World War broke out and the parliamentary socialists and philanthropic bourgeoisie sung jingo in chorus. Which leaves me to my last remark, which I am sure may be a shocker for many, which is that Georges Sorel was never a nationalist. Yeah, that's right. And if you want to know why, then, well, stay tuned for the Georges Sorel video, I guess. See ya. Peace. Yeah.
Weezy out of here.
Hey. Yeah.
Yo, Pierre, you wanna come out here?
Hey.
Metro booming, want some more, nigga.
Yeah. Hey. Pierre on the scene. It's not gonna be clean. He's gonna get me. Yeah. Out here. In the wild. Yeah. Shit ain't mild. Yeah. Fucking all these hoes. Yeah. Nobody knows. Yeah. 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 Hey. Fat nigga on the scene. He's gonna get me. He's gonna scream. Yeah. Hey. Like nobody's ever seen. Yeah. Fat nigga screams. Yeah. Yeah. You don't know what I mean. Yeah. But I'll do you clean. I won't be mean. I won't scream. Yeah. Yeah. You talking about your side hoes. I thought you need a main hoe to have side hoes. Wait. You got no hoes, just some Discord trannies. On that shit, while your parents pretend they don't know. Yeah? Hey. You're gay. Get owned.
Weezy out of here.